Hey Amud Beis will begin Daf Hey Amud Aleph right at the bottom. V'heicha itmar de Rava. So we discussed previously that Rav Amon said in the name of Rav Yochanan that if a person scooped water from his friend's chotzer, he scooped out the water and then he brought it into the Rishus HaRabim, he's chayiv. It's considered like he was oiker from the Rishus HaYochid and brought it into the Rishus HaRabim. So the problem was, he can only be considered an akira if he lifted it up from a stationary position. If the rain is falling and he scooped the rain, then where was the hanacha? If it's dripping down a wall, it's just rolling down, it never came to a resting place. So the more answer, just like we see in the case, the Rava says that kaisel meshupa, it's a wall that's sloping, so it has an incline, and therefore if he scooped it from the bottom of the wall where it was sloped, then that would be considered a resting place, and therefore he did the akira from the wall, and he brought the water into the Rishus HaRabim, and he's maniach, that's haitzah. So now the Gemara is questioning, where do we find where Rava said a case of kaisel meshupa where the wall is sloping, that we're comparing it to that case? What case is that we're referring to? The Rava said a kaisel meshupa. The heichid the Rava on the following. Now we learn if a person was reading from a Megillah Sefer, their svarim were made in the form of Megillah. So he was learning from a Sefer on a scoop, on a threshold. Now, if the threshold is between 3 and 9 tefachim from the ground, and it's dalet al dalet tefachim, that threshold would have a din of a karmelis. So if he's reading on the karmelis, now it's also to transport from a karmelis to Rishus HaRabim. He's on this threshold, he's on this porch or threshold. There's a street that's in front of him. He's reading from the Megillah, and it rolls down. He's holding on to one end of it, the other end rolled down into the street. Now, if it fell completely in the street and he picked it up, that would be also the Rabbanan. But since he's holding it on one end of it, that's not considered to be a haitzah bichlal. It's not considered to be a haitzah at all. Because haitzah is if the object, the chayfetz, is completely resting in one rishus and you transport it to the other. Now, min ha'Torah, if someone is holding onto a Megillah, he's holding onto one end, even if the other end would be in the street. And even if he would be, let's say, in a rishus ha'yachid, he would be on a rooftop holding onto one end, the other end is on the street. Midaraisa, that would not be considered haitzah or hachnasa because the object is not entirely into one rishus. So he's not carrying it completely from one rishus to the other because he's holding on to one end. Midrabanan, it would be awesome. But over here, if the object fell completely from his hand into the street, it still would not be also deraisa because this case over here is a karmelis. It'd be a rishus ram to a karmelis. Meaning, the Rabbanan were geyser when he held onto one end of it, and the other one was the other rishus, not to transport, not to bring it up, because it might lead to a case where it fell from his hand completely, and then he took it, he caught it, and he brought it into his rishus. But in this case over here, it can't lead to a deraisa because he's only in a karmelis. So therefore, if he's holding on to one hand, even though there is a gzera d'Rabbanan from Rishus HaYochid to Rishus HaRabim, holding on to one end of it, if the other end of it is in a different rishus, it's also midrabanan because it's a gzera that he might come and take it completely. It might fall completely from his hand, and he might come and catch it in midair and bring it to the rishus. But over here, it will not lead to a deraisa because he's only standing in a karmelis. So therefore, if he was kayer b'sefer haliskup of nisgalgal sefer miyodai, one end fell from his hand, it's dangling in the air, he can roll it up. But kayer b'reisha gag, but if he's on a rooftop, now the rooftop is more than 10 high and more than dalet al dalet. That's a rishus hayachid. V'nisgalgal sefer miyodai. In a similar case, if one end fell from his hand and it rolled down, if it hasn't reached 10 tefachim down, then he can roll it up. But mishigia liyud tefachim, but once it reached 10 tefachim or lower, now he's in the aver, in the airspace of the Rishus Harabim, then he cannot pick it up, because then it's a Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid. Now, even though he's holding on to one end of it, but it's Xera D'Rabbanan, so there we say Haychol Aksav. What he does is he turns it to the other side so that the written part of it is not exposed to the public. He has to deal with kavod to be mechabed that it's safer. So he turns it so that the what's exposed to the public is the smooth, is the blank side. What's written is covered by the wall. So why does he have to turn it to the other side? What is the problem over here? Why can't he roll it up, even though it's dangling in the airspace of the Rishus Harabim? But it's only dangling. So even if it fell completely from his hand, it would just be in midair. It's not resting in the Rishus Harabim. There wouldn't be any kind of Haitzarach Nasa anyway. Haitzarach Nasa is only from a stationary position. So why Haloi Noch? It hasn't landed, and then there's no Hanochem. So on that's what the case of Rav is referring to. What it means is that it's not that it's dangling in midair. If it would be dangling in midair, then you can't come to a Chiyuv D'Oraisa. What it means is, he's now he's reading the Megillah. One end of it falls from his hand. There's a sloped roof, so there's an incline. The end that fell from his hand is now resting, it's munach, on the incline of the wall. It's resting on that part of the wall, the incline. So that's munach. Now, if the other end, the one that he's holding onto, if it fell, that also fell from his hand, and now if he wanted to catch it while it was falling in midair, that would be, if he's on a rooftop, that would be a deraisa, because the item, the bottom of it is resting on the incline of the wall. It's munach on the meshupa part, the incline of the wall. It's considered to be munach in the Rishus Harabim. Now, if he would catch it and bring it back to him, he would be taking from the Rishus Harabim to the Rishus Hayach. So in this case, we say, even though he's holding on to one end of it, and it's not a deraisa in this case, the Rabbanan were geyser that you cannot roll it back, because we're geyser onto a case where it fell from his hand and he would try to catch it in midair. So therefore it's hayf chalak sav. But if he's in the previous case where it's on the threshold, which is only a threshold of Carmel is, since it can't come to the rice anyway, we're geyser. So this is the case that we're saying Rav says Kaisim Shubba. Similarly, you want to say in the case of Rav Yochanan that where there's a wall that's sloped, there's a Kaisim Shubba, it has an incline, and he scoops up water from that part, from the incline of the wall. He scoops it up and he transports it into the Rishus Harabim. Therefore, we should be chayev, because just like the Megillah, the Sefer is considered to be munach on that meshupa, the part that's meshupa. The water, similarly, is considered to be munach, and if he scoops it up and he brings it into the other shus, he should be chayev. Frak the Gemara, what do you mean? How can you compare the cases? How can you compare the case? Frag the Gemara, Amud Yomi Rava. Where did Rava say is considered to be munach on the kaisel meshupa? That's b'sefer Dovid denayach, because the end of the sefer of the Megillah is resting on that slope part of the wall. That's considered munach. It's stationary. So transporting, taking it from that position, is taken from mokum hanacha. But my miavida denayach. But water is constantly rolling, even though it's a sloped part of the wall. But it's only sloped. There's an incline. So water will roll. So that's not considered munach. That's not considered stationary. So why would you say scooping the water from that part of the wall is considered that it's oisah? It's not considered munach to begin with. Somewhere says enechanami. That is true. There would not be a chiyuv d'oraisa if somebody scooped water from a sloped wall and brought it into the Rishus Harabim. It is not considered munach. So what is the case that we're talking about where Rav Yochanan says if he scooped the water from his friend's chatzar and brought it to the Rishus Harabim that he's chayev? There was a pit, there was a guma, there was a ditch or a pit, and he scooped up the water in his hand and he brought it into the other Rishus. The Gemara, guma pshita, well of course. that if water is resting on the ground, it's resting in a bor and a guma, then he took the water from the Rishus Yachid to the Rishus Ram. Pshita, of course. What's the chiddush? Gemara says no. You might think he's taking the water from the surface, from what's closer, not the water that's actually resting on the ground. When you take an object and you carry it, you take an object from a table. The object is resting on the table. So if he takes a watch that's on a table and he takes it out and he transports it to the Rishus Rabim, he took it from a stationary position. But here, he's scooping the water from the surface of the guma. Now that water is not resting on the ground. So you might think it's not considered munach, and therefore it's not haitzah. So kamash malan that it is. And why taki is it? Because we say that the water is considered one item, is considered one entity. There's no difference between the water on the surface and the water on the bottom. It's as if you have a sefer. So the bottom part is on the table. And we don't say that, well, it's only the bottom that's on the table, not on the top that's on the table. The entire sefer is one entity. Similarly, water, it's all connected, it's one entity, even though you scooped it up from the surface, but that's considered munach on the ground, and therefore you took it from a stationary position, and it's haitzah. He follows his reasoning that we see over here, the Amar Rav. Water on top of water, it's one entity, so it's all considered munach. And transporting from the surface, scooping from the surface, is considered that you took it from its resting place. But if you have a nut floating on the water, the nut and the water is not one entity. So if you scooped up the nut from the water, it's not resting. The water, it's constantly moving. And the nut is not considered resting on the ground because it's not the same item. It's not one entity with the water. The water is resting on the ground. The egois is floating on the water. So therefore, he said, if he removes the egois from the water, that is not the raisa of haitzah, because the nut is not in a resting position. It's not munach. It's only floating on the water. It's not one entity with the water. They're two separate entities. But water, surface water, with the rest of the water is one entity, which is considered munach on the ground. So based on that, Boy Ravi had the following shaila: egois b'kli, if you have a nut that's in a container. Ukli tzaf al gabi mayim. Now the kli is floating on the water. So the egois, looking at it in itself, it is now in the, let's say, in the bowl. So it's munach, it's resting in the bowl. It's not floating, it's resting on the kli. But the kli that it's in, it itself is floating on the water. So the kli is not considered munach. It's only floating on the water. But the egois, now if you look at the egois itself, it's considered stationary in the kli, but the kli is only floating. So how do we view this? Do we view it from the perspective of the egois that considered munach? And therefore, if he removes it from there, it's like so. Or do we say no? You look at it from the perspective of the kli, and the kli is floating. It's not munach. Deny it. It's floating. Take it. It's a shaila. We have another shaila. Shemen shetzaf al gabi yayin. Well, let's say you have one liquid and another liquid. Now here previously we discussed water, surface water, and the water that's below the surface. That is further down. So that's one entity. But let's say you had two different liquids. Let's say you had wine on the water. Or for purposes of illustration, in this case, if you have oil on wine, what would be the din? So if they're two liquids, but they're two different types of liquids, is it considered one entity and it's munach? Or is it considered, no, two different entities and it's not munach? Is it considered like maim al gabi maim? Or is it considered like egois al gabi maim? So here we have machlokes Rav Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan. We can draw an analogy from a different case, and based on that, we would say it's a machlokes Rav Yochanan ben Nuri and Rabbanan. Just now, we learned in the Mishnah, shemen shetzaf al gabi yayin, if you have oil floating on wine. Now the halacha is that if a person becomes tomei, he has to be tovel in the mikveh. Now, prior to nightfall, he's considered tzvul yom. After nightfall, he's considered tohar. He's not matama truma by touching. He's allowed to eat truma. but he's considered prior to nightfall a Tul Yom, and he is not allowed to eat Truma, and if he touches it, he apostles it. So if you have wine of Truma, or you have oil of Truma, and you have a Tul Yom, now if the oil is floating on the wine, so what's closer to the surface is the oil, underneath it is the wine. If the Tul Yom touches what's on the surface, is it considered connected? Is it considered one item and he's matama both? Or is only matama what he touched? If it's considered one item, then he touched the surface, the whole thing becomes tome. Just like any time someone who's tome touches a food item, it's not only if he touches a loaf of bread, it's not only the place that he touched that is tome, it's one entity, the whole thing becomes tome. So if the two liquids, the oil and the wine, is considered one entity, even though we only touched the oil, he would matama the wine as well. But if they're considered two different entities, it's only the oil that's tome and not the wine. Now, the oil can't be matama the wine because the Tul Yom only passels, right? He only makes it into psul, which does not allow it, doesn't give it the tumah to transport, to transfer the tumah to another level. So it's possible, the Tul Yom makes something possible, which means it itself is possible, but it cannot be matame something else. So shemesh itself al gabi yain v'noga Tul Yom b'shemen, and the Tul Yom touched the oil which was closer to the surface. He touched the oil, lo yipasel l'shem bilvad. It's only the shemen that's possible, not the wine. So apparently the Chacham hold it's not one entity. Rav Yochanan ben Nuri Amar Shnei Muchbar Mzelaz. He says no, it's one entity, and not only is the oil possible, the wine is as well. So for our purposes, the Gabi Hilchos Shabbos would be the same thing. If you have two different liquids, so if you have oil and you have wine, or you have oil and water, or wine and water, is the one that's closer to the surface considered to be munach? If a person scooped up oil that's resting on water or on wine, he scooped it up and he brought it into the Rishus Harabim, would he be chayev? So according to the Rabbanan, he would be potter, because it's not considered one item, and therefore it's only resting on the liquid that's underneath it, which is not considered munach. It's not considered resting on the ground. But according to Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, it's considered all one. So just like the bottom liquid is resting on the ground, the surface liquid is also resting on the ground, so he would be chayev. Nu halacha, Amar Rav and Amar V'lo Amar Rav Yochanan. If a person picked something up on Shabbos and without any intent to carry it outside, and he had it on his shoulder or on his back, or he was carrying it, and he was going from one place to another, one end of the room to another end of the room, back and forth, and he had that with him. So when he picked it up, there was not for the purpose of carrying it outside. He picked it up for the purpose of guarding it, watching it, taking it from one end of the room to the other, but not to take it outside. Even if he was going back and forth the whole day, and then ultimately he went outside and he put it into the Rishus Harabim, he's not chayiv, because the first akira, when he picked it up, was not an akira of Haitzah. It was an akira to take it from one end of the room to the other. It was an akira just to have it with him for whatever purpose. And let's say he picked up a watch, he wanted to pick it up and he wanted to have it with him so he can know what time it was. And then hours later, perhaps, he went outside and he took it outside and he put it down. He is potter, he's not chayiv, because there was no akira. The original akira was not for the purposes of Eitzah. So it's only chayiv achiyamid. But if he stops, if he's stationary, now when he starts again and starts to walk again, that is a new akira. Now when he stopped, now if he decided he wants to go outside and he starts to walk again, the new act of starting to walk is a new akira, and the second akira is for the purpose of Haitzah, so then he would be chayiv. If he goes back and forth the whole day without stopping, the only akira was the original akira, which was not for the purpose of Eitzah, he's potter. But if he stopped, now when he starts to walk again, the new walking is a new act of akira. Now he has an akira, and Hanachi Bichayev. But stopping has to be when he's stopping to rest, not just stopping to adjust the load, not just stopping, pausing for a moment to adjust the item that he's carrying or to look at his watch. It means he's stopping to rest. Then when he starts again, that's considered an akira. But otherwise his stopping does not interrupt the original akira, does not put an end to the original akira that he made. So the akira that he had is only the initial akira, which was not for the purpose of Eitzah. So when we say when he stops and then he starts to walk again, he's chayiv, it's only if he stopped to rest. Mimai, why do we know that? If it's Toich Dalet Amos. Now there is, besides, as was mentioned before, besides Haitzah, besides Hachnasa, there's also a Chiyuv D'Oraisa if a person walks Dalet Amos or more in the Rishus HaRabim. Now it has some similarities to Haitzah and Hachnasa. A person is Chayev Dalet Amos Rishus HaRabim if he picks it up in the Rishus HaRabim. He walks Dalet Amos or more, and then he puts it down. You also need an Akira and Hanocha. Now the Dalet Amos has to be uninterrupted. So therefore, Toich Dalet Amos Amud Lafush Pot. If a person did that, he picked it up, the item. He was walking Dalet Amos, and he stopped. He stopped to rest before completing the Dalet Amos. He stopped to rest, he's potter, because he did not have one continuous act of walking or transporting Dalet Amos. He interrupted it. But that's only if he's Amud Lafush to rest. But if he only stopped momentarily to adjust the load, he's high, because that's not considered an interruption. That's not considered like there is a hanocha that he put it down. The opposite way, the corollary of that is chutz l'dalet amos. Now he has to, for dalet amos of Rishus HaRabim, you need an akira. He has to transport a dalet amos more and hanoch. So he's only high if he puts it down on Shabbos, dalet amos or more past where he started. So if it's chusl dalet amos amud lafush chai. If it's more than dalet amos, now he's stopped to rest. That's considered like he put it down. It's considered a hanoch. He's chai. Lekasef is potter. But if he only did it to adjust the load, then he's potter because it's not considered to be munach. So therefore, you see this distinction between lekasef, lafush, or lekasef. So, what's the chiddush in this case over here? What's the chiddush in the case that we're saying? That if he picked it up, and if he started when he was walking the whole day, back and forth, and then he took it out, he's potur. What's the chiddush in this halacha that he just said? The chiddush is, you mean to tell me that when he picked it up, if he didn't do it for the purposes of Haitzah, he picked it up to take it from one end to the other end. He picked it up to look at his watch. And then he went outside his potter because his original akira was not for the purposes of Haitzah. So why are you telling me this? He already told us that. If a person is taking from one corner to the other corner of the house, and then he changed his mind and he decided to take it outside pot, or his pot. So he already told us this, Rav Yochanan. Why is he telling us again? It seems to be the very same halacha, it's just expressed in a different way. But it's the same principle. More answers, Hanami. He only said it once. But the Talmidim, they said it, this principle of Rav Yochanan, it was expressed in two different ways. One said it in the Lashon of that Hayaton Ochlam Mashkim, and the other said it in the Lashon of Mamar Chafatz Mizavs Lazavis. But it's really Rav Yochanan said it once. It's the principle is that even if a person picked something up, he did an akira, and then he took it out and did an hanoch Rishus HaRabim. But if his original akira was not for the purposes of Haitzah, unless he interrupted that and he stopped and he started again, then he'd be potter, because shaloi ha'isa kirishain lekav. A new halach. Ton Rabbanan Maitzim Yechanus Leplatya Derech Stav Chayiv. Haitzah is, as we said, if he takes it from a Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. Now, let's say a person took something from it's a store. That has a din of Rishus HaYachid. It's a private area. It's a store. He took it to a platya, the square. That's where the market is. That's where the people buy and sell. That's considered Rishus HaRabim. And he took it derech stav. He went from the store. He had to pass through the stav, which is a seating area, which has benches over there. And those benches are considered a karmelis. They're more than 3 from the ground. They're not more. They're between 3 and 9. They're not 10 or more high. So the essential issue over here is, instead of transporting directly from the Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim, a person transported, he picked it up from the Rishus HaYachid, from the store, and he passed through a karmelis before putting it down on the street in the Rishus HaRabim. So the Hoitzah was interrupted, so to speak, by walking through the karmelis. Now, if he stopped in the karmelis, certainly he'd be potter. That would be considered taking from the Rishus HaYachid to the karmelis, and then if he picked it up again, and then picking up again and taking from the karmelis to the Rishus HaRabim, then certainly it would be also midrabanan, but it would be potter midaraisa. But over here, he did not stop. He picked it up in the street. He walked through the karmelis, through the bench there where benches are, and he put it down, and he stopped in the Rishus HaRabim. The fact that he walked through the karmelis, is that significant or not? So the Tana Kamal say Chayiv. He is Chayiv. Ben Azai Paiter. And Ben Azai says you're potter. So Bishlam Ben Azai, why would Ben Azai say you're potter? Because we understand because he says a person who is walking, it's like he takes a step, it's like he's picking it up. Now we say when a person walks, akiras gufaka akiras chayfetz. So when a person is standing still, he starts to walk. The act of starting to walk is like picking up the item. But then Ben Azai holds when he puts another foot down, when he puts a second foot down, it's like he stopped again. So each act, each step when he walks is like an act of akira and anacha, Now, if there's no karmelis separating the Rishus HaYachid and the Rishus HaRabim, the last step from the Rishus HaYachid, it's like he picked it up from the Rishus HaYachid, he takes a step into the Rishus HaRabim, he put it down into the Rishus HaRabim, he'd be Chayiv. But if he walks through the karmelis, so before he gets to the Rishus HaRabim, his last step is in the karmelis. So it's considered like he stopped in the karmelis, then he took it up from the karmelis into the Rishus HaRabim, which is potter. It's considered, even though he originated the walking from the street, from the store rather, from the Rishus HaYachid, but the last step before the street was from the karmelis. So he's potter because he holds Mahalech is Kaimedami. But according to the Rabbanan, Rabbanan don't hold that. They don't hold that each step is considered that he akira and hanacha. They look at it as one continuous act. He started from the resting position to walk. That's the akira. The hanacha takes place when he stopped walking. They don't view each step as a continual akira and hanacha. Now, but Afrak the Gemara, even though that's true that they don't hold that Mahalach is Kaimed, but where do we find such a scenario that transporting, you can transport through the Rishus HaYachid, through a karmelis to the Rishus HaRabim? Now, this question of the Gemara will be elaborated on the next Amud, which Be'ez Hashem will see. We'll see later. But in the meantime, the Gemara says that Bishlam ben Azai, we understand. He holds Mahalach Kaimet. Therefore, if you're transporting or you're walking, carrying something from a store, Rishus HaYachid through a karmelis to the street, we understand why he says it's potter, because he holds that Mahalach is Kaimet. For Taisus, how's it Shayach that Mahalach is Kaimen? How are you ever going to be Chayiv in Dalet Amas Rishus HaRabim? If every step is considered to be like you did an akira, and when you put your next foot down, it's a hanoch. So how are you ever going to have Dalet Amas Bershus Harabim? You never have a continual Dalet Amas. You have a series of Akira and Anocha, Akira and Anocha. You never have Dalet Amas in one stretch. So his answer is that's not fair, because Dalet Amas Bershus Harabim is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that's the halacha that even though it is in that manner, the Torah is mechayev. By Haitzah is different. The Haitzah, the Torah says it has to be an Akira and a Hanocha, and therefore each step is considered a separate Akira and Hanocha. So walking through a Carmelist Benaz, I would hold, you've interrupted the Akira from the Rishus HaYachid with the Hanocha and the Carmelist. Now, even though Dalet Amas B'Rishus HaRabim would be a continual series of Akiras and Anochas, and Dalet Amas has to be in one stretch for the purposes of the Chiyuv of Dalet Amas B'Rishus HaRabim, that's considered to be one stretch. That's considered to be uninterrupted. Similarly, as we would say, if you hold Kluta Kamisha Huncha, and if a person throws Dalet Amas B'Rishus HaRabim, now if you hold Kluta Kamisha Huncha, it's considered like it now landed. It landed in the Rishus. Nevertheless, we don't say it's considered like he threw Dalet Amas in the Rishus HaRabim. It's like it landed and it went down and up, and then Hanocha and Akira and Hanocha. For the purposes of Dalet Amas, that's sufficient to be considered that it's one stretch, it's uninterrupted. But as far now, even though we say Klut Kamishun, we threw it from a Rishus HaYachid through a Carmelist into the Rishus HaRabim, it would be significant, it would make a difference, but not for the purposes of Dalet Amas Rishus HaRabim. So this is Machlokes Ben Azai and Chachamim. Be'ez Hashem, we'll see on this further.